Happy Barbenheimer, everybody! I hope that you've all had a chance to experience both of these incredible films in the theater, because a weekend like this past one very rarely ever comes along, and I, for one, have spent a lot of time savoring and enjoying it. Barbie was a whole lot of fun, and I thoroughly enjoyed myself, but Oppenheimer? Jesus Christ. Christopher Nolan is one of the most instantly recognizable names in modern cinema, but before this weekend, I remained hesitant to referring him as one of my favorite filmmakers. But after this bad boy, I think I'm starting to swing the other way. Now that the film is officially out worldwide, it seems like the perfect time to do a good old-fashioned retrospective on the man's work and talk about each one of his films from the worst to the best. Disclaimer up front, Christopher Nolan has never once made a bad movie. Gonna say that right off the bat so that nobody gets their panties in a twist, because as usual with lists like this, there are probably going to be one or two controversial takes, but I, at the very least, like all of his movies, so we can all put our worries to bed on this one. Before we jump in, I also just want to make sure I do my part and acknowledge the WGA and SAG-AFTRA strikes that are currently plaguing our beloved industry. Our writers and actors are in a very tough spot right now, both creatively and financially. I am not a member of either union, but I know several people that are, and it is a very upsetting and unnecessary situation we have no business being put through again, and I hope that one day soon, studios and executives will come to their senses and compensate all of the wonderful people that make all of them all of their precious money. If you want to learn more about the respective strikes, the other unions that are also in danger of striking, or if you just want to know how you can help, I will be putting links to various resources in the description of this video, and hopefully soon, cinema can go back to being appreciated on an individual artistic basis, as opposed to every film being owned and traded like a glorified NFT. Thank you all for listening and caring. Let's get started. This is definitely the definitive and pretty much universally agreed upon spot for Following to be in. It's Nolan's first feature, and it has debut film written all over it. The acting is extremely clunky, the writing is inconsistent, and there's an overall feeling of messiness in the very short runtime. The characters don't have nearly enough time to fully develop, and by the end of the movie, the film expects you to have changed your perspective on these men multiple times, when you never really had the time to form even one opinion on them from the start. With all of that being said, though, there is a lot of this film that really works for me now, better than it actually used to. What fascinates me the most about debut films from iconic filmmakers is looking at all of the little nuggets and seeds they plant and experiment with that foreshadow their future style. The music plays a major role in the film, as does the overall sound design and edit. The film plays with time a lot, like most of Nolan's work. It uses it to its advantage to keep the audience interested in this admittedly not all that inherently interesting premise. The camera work, while amateurish a lot of the time, also adds a lot of sense of chaos into the narrative. There is a lot here to appreciate, even if the story and characters are incredibly lacking. Insomnia is the one film that sticks out like a mildly sore thumb in the rest of his filmography. It is a remake of a Swedish film from the 90s and is the only film of Nolan's that doesn't credit him as a writer. As a result, a lot of this film is devoid of his style. There's still a ton of blue because Christopher Nolan loves his blue aesthetics, but structurally this film is for the most part very safe and standard and doesn't have very much of anything that separates it from your standard early 2000s murder mystery thriller. There are a couple of really haunting moments, particularly in the first half of the film, that are directed extremely well. The chase scene in the fog, as well as the log chase scene in particular, are both very well done scenes. As the film progresses and the mystery is revealed, way too early I might add, this is when the film becomes way too conventional to remain terribly invested in it. A little over halfway through, if you've been paying attention, you can pretty much tell beat for beat where the film is going to go and end. The final scene does wrap everything up in a very nice way, and it completes all the arcs for our characters in a satisfying moment, but all the while leading up to it, it's definitely a bit of a structural letdown for Nolan. Batman Begins. I have tried so desperately to love this movie as much as other people I know, but alas, just like the first time I saw it, I just think it's pretty good. I think it does a wonderful job at world building and establishing a trilogy-wide tone. The themes for the entire trilogy are not only set up wonderfully, but they're also analyzed better in just this one movie than other film series do in their whole trilogy. The casting of every single character is spot on. Well, almost every single character. The origin story here is one of the better ones we've got in a superhero movie, and it's great to see how Bruce Wayne becomes and eventually gets lost in the character of Batman to hide from the true problems he really has to face in his personal life. All of that stuff is great. But sheesh, is it so glaringly obvious that Christopher Nolan was insanely overwhelmed in the making of this movie. This is by far the film of his that over-relies on CGI the most, and not a lot of it has aged very well. The editing overall, but especially the action scenes, is straight up awful and incomprehensible at times. Katie Holmes might be the worst actor to ever walk the earth, and I've also always found the pacing of this movie extremely clunky. This is the only film in the trilogy that I won't go out of my way to watch if I'm not marathoning all three, which has only happened once or twice before. So overall, there's a lot of great in here, but for every great thing that I love, there is one other mildly annoying thing that holds this back from being something really special. The Dark Knight Rises is by far Nolan's most frustrating film. The highs in this film are so high and the lows are so low that for a long time it was difficult for me to accurately describe how I felt about the film. Thankfully, there are more highs in this one than there are lows, but we still have to watch Marion Cotillard's death scene, so that's an automatic 1 to 2 points off. Nolan was definitely struggling here to make a film that explored challenging ideas and had a somber, almost hopeless tone to it, while also delivering on a satisfying conclusion to an Avengers-level blockbuster. Literally, this movie came out 2 months after the Avengers. I've never really had a problem with Bane's voice, although it is hard to deny that the sound mixing in this movie definitely has its moments of straight-up bad.
It and the borrowed time you've all been living on. Huh?
There's also a good 20 minutes in the second act where next to nothing of value happens and could easily be cut or edited to be more clean. With all of that being said, overall it is a very emotionally satisfying conclusion to the trilogy. The action is unsurprisingly gorgeously shot, the arcs for each characters are tied up wonderfully, and the themes of the whole trilogy are simultaneously wrapped up while still sometimes remaining up in the air. Michael Caine has never been better than in this movie, and I most certainly appreciate the slow, poetic tone of the film, as it's something that nearly no other summer blockbusters are able to effectively encapsulate. Alright, I just want to make it clear before we move on that every movie on the list from here on out I genuinely love. So don't get too sad if your favorite movie is in the number 8 spot, because I love the number 8 spot. Someone has to take one for the team and take the number 8 spot, okay? Let's go. Tenet is the bomb.com. Yes, it makes absolutely no sense. Yes, the characters are completely distant. Yes, there is next to nothing to get attached to emotionally. Yes, I'm still irritated that the protagonist never got his damn hot sauce. Yes, it's weird that the main character is literally called the protagonist. Yes, it's weird that this movie was released at the height of the pandemic. And this is coming from somebody who very naively thought that this film was going to make $500 million and single-handedly credit Nolan for ending a worldwide pandemic. But putting all that aside, this movie absolutely rips. It is so much fun. The cult following that this film has gotten in just barely 3 years of existence is legitimately hilarious. The action and the practical effects, as always, are eye-melting. I'll admit that I was apprehensive when I saw someone that wasn't Hans Zimmer credited with doing the score, but after watching the film, Ludwig Göransson knocked it out of the park. Plus, it gave us the unlikely friendship of Chris Nolan and sicko mode himself, Travis Scott. Not much else to say about this one. It is a hilarious hot mess at times, but it is my hilarious hot mess, god damn it. I have an immense soft spot for Dunkirk. It came out in the summer of 2017, which was easily a top 3 summer, and it was the first film I ever saw in 70mm. I think that the biggest thing, and honestly the only thing that is holding Dunkirk back from being an all-timer, is the fact that it's PG-13. There is a lot that Dunkirk accomplishes despite this restriction, but there are still several undeniable moments here that are completely devoid of realism due to it. This incredibly famous shot, which even Tarantino says is one of the greatest shots in history, and in a lot of ways you could certainly argue that it is, the fact that none of these people are legitimately blown to pieces, or at the very least shown sustaining serious injuries, is kind of a detriment to the moment. Still though, this is Nolan at some of his most intentional directing and editing of his career. His classic non-linear storytelling is perfect for a story like this, and it really makes the story flow nicer and build to a much more moving conclusion. The performances from everyone, while minimalist, are all incredible. The musical score is very ambient and suspenseful. The constant motifs of time used in Nolan's films work more here in the score than any of Nolan's films except maybe Inception. It's one of his shorter works too, especially for a war film, which I really appreciate. It never feels overindulgent or pretentious. It knows exactly how long it needs to take to tell its story and never once overstays its welcome. It just feels like a really go-to-the-theater film movie, you know, sort of the reason why you go, to watch something on the big screen. Memento is a mind-blowing first 2 to 3 watches. I saw this when I was like 12 years old, and the only thing that mattered to me when it was over was making sure that everybody I knew in the entire world had seen it too. I had never seen anything like it before, and to this day I've never seen anything quite like it. But now, at the ripe, near-death old age of 20, having seen the film nearly a dozen times, some, not all, but some of the effect has worn off just a bit. The reason I say that this is a mind-blowing first 2 to 3 watches is that that's really all you need to catch up on all the hints that Nolan drops throughout the runtime of the film, and to figure out where the film eventually winds up going. The story here is incredibly simple and really relies on the structure of the narrative to keep everything afloat. Once the twist is revealed, it is once again mind-blowing and incredibly written, but after a couple rewatches, you've already picked up on everything and there isn't much more new to learn. Films of Nolan's like Inception or The Prestige have elements to them that even up to this most recent rewatch for this video I still noticed, which floored me by how hidden in plain sight they all are. With Memento, I think that it's just slightly too simple for its own good in the rewatchability department. This film has one of Nolan's most unique casts, which I really like. Everyone does a great job here, but especially Guy Pearce, whose performance is very underrated in Nolan's filmography. Same with the musical score. It's very understated and unsettling and really helps all the paranoia be sold and makes Leonard's experience all the more frightening. The pacing is very smart and it allows you to try and be one step ahead of the film the whole time. Of course, you never really are, but Nolan does a great job of allowing you to think that you are before slapping you in the face with how wrong you actually were. This is definitely one of the more nostalgic films for me in this filmography, even if some of the initial love spark may have faded. I don't like to formulate my thoughts on any given rewatch of Interstellar until many hours after I've watched the film, because that's usually how long it takes for my opinion on it to start to get any amount of consistent. The viewing experience for this film is often a mix of awe, intense emotion, and intense frustration. A lot of this movie is some of the most insane, jaw-dropping visuals you've ever seen, some of the most beautifully composed music ever written, some of Nolan's greatest sequences and set pieces, some of his most emotionally intense moments, and also some of the dumbest, cringiest, and emotionally unavailable moments in his filmography. Many characters we spend a lot of time with here are intensely underdeveloped, and we are never given adequate time with them to develop an emotional attachment. Many elements of the third act, especially as well, are bottom tier Nolan and make me roll my eyes multiple times a viewing. But then for some reason, every time I watch the film, the moment it ends, everything is put into perspective, and in the context of the whole thing, all the bad stuff seems to work all of a sudden. It's a very bizarre feeling that I don't know how to properly articulate, but everything I really don't like about this movie in the moment feels much less problematic once it's all over. It's very well paced for its runtime, and on top of that, it has the docking sequence, so that on its own cements this as a really great film overall. The Prestige is another one of my more nostalgic entries on this list. When I was a little kid, I had a nasty habit of asking too many questions during a movie that would probably be answered had I just shut up and paid attention. So my parents specifically told me that I wasn't allowed to ask more than 3 questions during my first watch of this film because I needed to pay extra close attention. I can't remember how many of those 3 questions I used or what they were for, but at the end of the day, this film obviously blew 10-year-old me's mind. And for good reason, since it still blows 20-year-old me's mind in a lot of ways. So many of this film's secrets are hidden so unabashedly in plain sight that on rewatch you almost kick yourself for not having seen it the first time. But the film geniusly even calls you out on your own self-pity by acknowledging that we were never really looking for the clues to begin with, since as the audience we want to be tricked and fooled by a film like this. One of those moments where you're actually genuinely happy that the movie knows that it's smarter than you. The nature and the morals behind the rivalry between these two men is endlessly engaging and thought-provoking. Every new trick they play on each other effectively raises the stakes without ever jumping the shark or revealing either of these characters' master plans. Watching someone destroy the life they have is never not masochistically fun to watch, and with this film, it's hard to find a story like this more intense, and sometimes even frightening. Speaking of frightening Christopher Nolan movies, listen, I know I've only seen it once, and it hasn't had the time to properly age like the other films on this list, but holy shit. I could easily see this taking the number 2 or 1 spot one day down the line. Oppenheimer is extraordinary. What Christopher Nolan has done here is take a story that took shockingly long to be made into a quality film, by the way, and fired every single one of his filmmaking fortes from point-blank range out of a 12-gauge shotgun. There are hints of Fincher, Kubrick, Hitchcock, even Tarkovsky or Klimov in here, and it legitimately, no pun intended, blew my mind. The best thing about Oppenheimer, besides all of the obvious technical aspects like sound, visuals, cinematography, editing, writing, directing, pacing, literally everything, fuck it, throw it out the window. The best thing about this film is how easily and seamlessly it presents a real historical event from an unbiased perspective, while simultaneously having such a well-taken, nuanced stance on this event at its core, and it never once expects the audience to blindly align with it. Every moment in this film, every cut, every line of dialogue, every major event is simply presented at face value and allows for complete individual interpretation. It does not pretend to know more than you, it does not try to talk down to you, it does not try to over-explain anything to you. It just simply exists, and it is spectacular. And that ending, Jesus! So brilliantly simple. I was wondering throughout the entire runtime how Nolan was going to decide to end such a behemoth of a film, and the decision to end it so small, intimate, and in a way, uneventfully, just made the whole thing all the more terrifying. As an audience, we've come to expect big, grandiose, loud endings from Christopher Nolan, that having arguably his largest film yet end on such a small note, and to have that small ending not feel anticlimactic, but instead a perfect encapsulation of all 3 hours of mass hysteria that came before it, is the biggest compliment I can give. This is one of the most important films in recent history, and I'm going to be thinking about it for a really, really long time. Ah, yes, the film that destroyed the modern movie trailer. I'm sure that's the legacy Chris Nolan wanted for all this. All jokes aside, it's kind of hard to talk about Inception as well as the obvious number one spot for this list because it's impossible to add any sort of thoughtful analysis that hasn't already been said 1,000 times before. This is by far Christopher Nolan at his most stylistic and inventive. In terms of actual filmmaking, this is by far his most influential and imitated work. In terms of story, that's for the number one spot. Inception has the impossible task of juggling sometimes 3 action movies at once inside of the same narrative, and not only does it work, it passes with flying colors. Every action scene tops the last, and I don't think this film is given nearly enough credit for how hard it hits emotionally at the end of the day. The storyline with Cillian Murphy and his father coming to a head at the end, accompanied by the brilliant Hans Zimmer's music, is one of my favorite moments in a Nolan film. Pure emotion-wise, this film hits way harder for me than something like Interstellar does. Every character has their moment to shine here, no one is ever tossed to the side. It is one of the neatest films ever made that has so much going on in it, and obviously the final shot is one for the history books. If you've never seen this one, I'd highly recommend giving it a try. I mean, duh. But for real, like, what else would it be? The Dark Knight is such a legendary, mythic-level movie that has become so cemented in the cultural pantheon that it's genuinely difficult to find someone who hasn't seen the movie at least once. It revolutionized comic book films, it revolutionized blockbusters, it revolutionized movies. It has peak Hitchcockian levels of suspense and tension that is only aided by the miraculous editing. Seriously, some of the best cutting I've ever seen in a movie. The final 10 minutes belong in a museum. There isn't a single solitary moment to this movie that I would in any way alter, and it's because of that I'm not going to talk any more about it because, like I said previously, I have nothing new to bring to the table, so best leave well enough alone. Kaboom! Thank you all for watching. If you haven't seen any of these movies, you absolutely should. I think every single one of them is worth your time. Happy Barbenheimer once again. I can't wait to see both of these amazing films again in the theater. What a freaking time to be alive at the movies. Thank you again for sticking around, and I will see all of you in the next video. Peace out.